John B. Watson was born on September 9, 1878. He was born in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. His parents' names were Pickens Butler.
Growing up, John would tell me stories all the time about how his dad was very high-tempered, and that's really why I believe John got in so much trouble.
John Watson lived in poverty for most of his childhood. Since his father could not be a leader of his family, his eldest brother, Edward, had to step up and help.
It was hard being the man in the family, but it needed to be done. I ended up getting a lot of respect from my mother, though, because she respected that I did a lot around the house.
For most of John's teenage years, he was swearing and drinking and doing many things that his parents did not approve of.
John always wanted to stand out. He always had something to say. That's why, at the age of 16, I was glad he entered Furman University.
Watson studied with Gordon B. Moore. John first gained national press coverage when his research was viewed as controversial. Although he was professional, statements showed that he retained some of his combative character. While in Chicago, Watson did many of the following things to keep him out of trouble. He waited tables, helped out psychologists in other departments, and cared for white rats. While in Chicago, he also worked with a handful of scientists.
John was a great student and eager to learn. He studied with me as well as Donaldson and Loeb. We worked great together because we were both experimental scientists and mechanicistic materialists.
Yeah, I definitely agree. After studying with him for a little while, I realized he was really interested in physiology and neurology, so I think that's why he got his PhD in 1903.
He stayed in Chicago as an assistant in a psychology department for a year and then advanced to an instructor. On December 26, 1903, he was secretly married to Mary Hicks. Redid the wedding for family and friends publicly. Soon Watson settled down in Chicago and studied a different way of interpreting psychology. He coined the term behaviorism. His focused observations were on living things. He believed that in order for psychology to be considered a true science, it needed to have a substance that could be measured quantitatively. John abandoned the theory of consciousness altogether and focused more on behavior directly. This is more on what people say and do.
I worked very closely with John because we were both behavioralists and believed in the same ideas. It was an honor working with John because he was and still is the father of behavioralism. Our hard work and dedication dominated the field of psychology.
A lot of psychologists looked up to Watson. In 1907, he was named professor of comparative and experimental psychology at Johns Hopkins University.
I'm really happy that my article inspired John to take a look more into psychology. In my article, I talked about control over human beings as a goal of psychology and rejected the introspective techniques that were used in a lot of investigations in the human mental functioning processes.
John and I used to talk all the time about how he thought psychology should be based more on observations, but I thought that was crazy. I really believed in what the structuralists had to say.
Finally, in 1907, he began to develop his idea that animal psychology could serve as a base for human psychology and decided to tell people about it. He claimed that scientists should not attribute mental content to animals but study their behaviors. And by the next 4 years, Watson perfected his behavioristic theory.
John was not like us. He did not attempt to describe the psychological process involving in thinking, but only the observable changes in behavior. His new idea of psychology represented a substantial shift in the viewpoint from the conventional mentalists that John had been taught. Also, John brought up the study nature versus nature. He pretty much downplayed the importance of heredity, maintaining that behavior is governed primarily by the environment. We worked a lot together in his lab at Johns Hopkins Medical School. However, we had a biological approach to human thought and behavior. We worked on color vision together and experimented on learned instinctive behavior in various animals. I remember in 1910, 1912, and 1913, when John gained professional recognition and joined the editing group of Psychological Review publications and the Journal of Animal Behavior, Mausel.
In 1950, John Watson became president of the American Psychological Association. In his presidential address, he brought the idea of conditional reflexes into his psychological schema. Soon after there, he added a psychopathology, acknowledging the important work of Sigmund Freud. In 1918, John volunteered in the Army. He worked on the Air Corps personnel problems, and when he came back from war, he immediately went back to Johns Hopkins University to perform his most famous experiment.
In 1920, John created an experiment to test emotional conditioning. He wanted to prove that, through conditioning, he could cause a child with a neutral or positive response to a stimulus to fear it and related stimuli. In this experiment, he used a child and showed him a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, a monkey, and masks with and without hair. As a stimuli, and struck a steel rod with a hammer to incite the fear response. When introduced to the furry animal things, baby Albert was either neutral towards the stimulus or showed a positive response. In this case of the white rat, which he enjoyed, he then introduced a stimuli, in this case a loud noise produced from a hammer. When he presented the objects to little Albert again, he would also present the noise of the stimuli simultaneously. This caused baby Albert to cry. And after repetitions of stimuli being presented, it caused the baby Albert to dislike the objects even if the noise isn't being made. He directly associated the object's looks with its sounds, even if the object never actually produced the sound itself.
John loved to do experiments. He'd be in the lab all the time working with animals. He tested the reactions of the rats by putting them through mazes.
Watson became successful and felt financial ease for the first time in his life. Watson switched his work field from psychology to accounting. Among his important accounts were Norwich Pharmaceutical Company, Baker's Coconut, Maxwell's House Coffee, Sharpay and Dome, General Motors Overseas, and Pond's, for the last of which he inaugurated a famous and successful testimonial campaign. For some years, Watson hoped to return to psychology, and he tried to spend evenings on scientific matters.
He trained for a while and soon became an account executive, and in 1924, one of the 4 vice presidents of the company.
Watson became successful and felt financial ease for the first time. Watson switched his work field from psychology to accounting. Among his important accounts were Norwich Pharmaceutical Company, Baker's Coconut, Maxwell House Coffee, Sharpay and Dome, General Motors Overseas, and Pond's, the last of which he inaugurated a famous and successful testimonial campaign. For some years, Watson hoped to return to psychology, and he tried to spend evenings on scientific matter, but his prosperity made him feel conflicted. Instead of addressing an academic audience, Watson gave popular lectures and published articles and books. In effect, he acted as an advertiser for behavioristic viewpoint. His most important influence came in a rapidly expanding field, child-rearing advice. His idea was not to cuddle or spoil infants, but to condition them to lead independent lives, appeared in his own publications and in writings of other child-rearing experts of the 1920s and later. After his wife died in 1935, Watson was very much less in the public eye. In 1936, he left J. Walter Thompson to work for William Etsy and Company, again as vice president.
There he worked mostly on drug and cosmetic accounts, including Heinz Honey and Almond Cream, Dorothy Gray, and Tussie. He retired in 1945. During retirement, he kept busy working with farming and building projects in rural Connecticut. He died on September 25, 1958, in New York City. While behaviorism began to lose its hold after 1950, many of the concepts and principles are still widely used today.